Hello, everyone, and welcome to our new Living With series, hosted by the Hypersomnia Foundation. My name is Claire Wylds-Wright, and I'm particularly excited to kick off episode 1 today with Dr. Emmanuel Mignot. Many of you already know him, familiar with his work and his research, but I would love to introduce him to you today and dig into the conversation that we have for those specifically living with idiopathic hypersomnia. So Emmanuel Mignot then, we know him as a clinician and a researcher. He holds the Craig Reynolds Professor of Sleep Medicine in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. And he's also the director of the Center for Narcolepsy and is recognized widely for discovering the cause of narcolepsy. Dr. Mignot has received numerous awards for his work, including very recently the 2023 Breakthrough Prize in Life Sciences. But I'm particularly excited to talk to him today because we know that he's made so many discoveries about narcolepsy, and now he's turning his curiosity to idiopathic hypersomnia. In today's episode, we discuss many things: home testing, future treatments, challenges to diagnostic, delays, why patients with IH are so delayed in their diagnostic journey, quality of life issues, and also upcoming treatments within research and within industry. So I'm super excited today. Before I jump into the conversation with Emmanuel, I would really like to thank our sponsors. That's Jazz Pharmaceuticals, Avadel, Harmony Biosciences, Takeda, Centessa, and Zevra. Without their sponsorship, this series would not be possible. Now let's jump into our conversation with Dr. Mignot. So I wanted to start with how I met you, actually. So Matilda's 16, and I think I met you when she was just 4, and I just landed in California, and I came to California because for 2 reasons, actually, from the UK, for 2 reasons. So she was very young, obviously at the age of 3, being diagnosed with type 1 narcolepsy. And I was told by your assistant, Marley Arnin, that if we get to California, we could get 2 things. One of them was Xyrem, which is what was lacking in the UK. And the other thing was expert care, which was also lacking in the UK. So that was 2011. And I think I drove up to Stanford with her and met you for the first time. And thank you for being her doctor until now. She's 16. So I've known you for a long time, obviously on 2 levels. One is more personal and the other is more professional. So I'm particularly excited for you to talk to us about your expertise, narcolepsy, also idiopathic hypersomnia, in my role as CEO of the Hypersomnia Foundation. So I'd love to just jump in and ask you a few questions, if that's okay, about idiopathic hypersomnia specifically, and where your research is at, and also congratulations on your recent significant prize. Maybe start with the most recent. So tell us about the prize that you just won for your contribution to science and sleep.
Yes, no, it's true that I've been very lucky to get this breakthrough prize for my work on narcolepsy. No, I don't know if you necessarily know what the breakthrough prize is, but it's a pretty high honor. You know, that it's a prize that has been dubbed a little bit like the Oscar of science because they try to make it a bit flashy. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, they haven't had any reception, because usually the receptions are always very glamorous, but hopefully they will have one soon.
Is that a red carpet event? Is that a red carpet event? Is that what you mean?
Yes, definitely. You know, I've tried to suggest that they should invite Beyoncé, but unfortunately, I think she's very expensive.
Oh my God.
I prefer to have the money for my research.
Yes. Yeah. And it was a significant amount of funding, correct? Because I know as a eminent researcher is always the fight for funding. I mean, it's a reality that I know that you administratively have to deal with, and that's a burden in some ways when you should be really just in the lab doing what you do.
It's true. Finding funding is always a struggle because we always have a lot of paperwork to fill up and a lot of files to report, and grants to submit. We lose a lot of time doing that, for sure.
Right.
But I don't know if there is a better system, you know.
Right.
And philanthropy has also its limitation, I think, because, you know, philanthropists are not necessarily scientists, and they sometimes have their own opinion on what should be done. And even so, I don't want to always criticize philanthropy. I think there's a little bit of hubris out there, where people kind of believe that just because they've been very successful in business, you know, they think they can solve all the world's problem. And that's not necessarily as simple.
Yeah, it's a real burden, I can imagine. So in terms of your research,
Nonetheless, I accept the money from anywhere.
yeah.
You know?
So yeah, let's just put that out there to our audience. No, it's a really important cause, and
I should say that some people also, sometimes some philanthropies, they just donate the funding with very little ties attached. And that's so much easier than the government, for example.
Right.
We have to report on every penny, and it sometimes doesn't make any sense. I mean, it's not like, often we have the impression when we get grants from the government that we are there to try to misuse the funds, you know, like if we had time to misuse the funds. We always try to do our best with as little funds as possible. That's what we do all day long.
Yeah. So the message is unrestricted grants from donors. Awesome.
True.
So let's talk about your current research in the context of sleep disorders, and perhaps pertaining more specifically for our audience for idiopathic hypersomnia. And I do want to talk more about the language around IH, but for now, where are you at with your research?
So idiopathic hypersomnia is a little bit the forgotten child of you know, disorders of excessive daytime sleepiness. You know, it is true that a lot of research has been done on narcolepsy, especially narcolepsy type 1, cataplexy, and of course the cause of narcolepsy has been found, largely through my work. But for idiopathic hypersomnia, personally, I have not worked as much on it because I knew from the start that it was going to be more complicated. And I like to start with simpler problems. But now that narcolepsy is solved, I'm personally turning my attention to idiopathic hypersomnia. And I have some very specific ideas on how to address it. So I can tell you exactly what I mean by that. So first, you know, idiopathic hypersomnia is not like narcolepsy, cataplexy. It's not what I would call a disease entity. It's very unlikely that it's just all the same cause that produces symptoms. It's more like a group of problems that manifest with having sleepiness unexplained, but it's very unlikely to have a single cause like narcolepsy and orexin deficiency. And in that direction, I think we have to go down to study why people are tired in idiopathic hypersomnia. And there is two main mechanisms that regulate why people are tired during the day or sleep at night. One is the circadian clock, and the other is the sleep debt. And now what I'm doing is I'm trying to develop new tools that will allow to measure circadian rhythm very well with one blood sample, and also sleep debt very well with a single blood sample. So what I hope to achieve is that if someone comes with idiopathic hypersomnia, the person is tired, but we really don't know why. Is that because the person is kind of living in permanent jet lag? That's one possibility. Is that because the person is not having good sleep? You know, their sleep is not dense enough, is not restorative enough? That's a possibility. Or is it because their wake promoting system are not good enough? You know, they have enough sleep, but they can't really stay awake during the day, so they're kind of passive. So these three explanations could be all resulting in idiopathic hypersomnia. And I'm trying to find blood biomarkers that could indicate if the cause of idiopathic hypersomnia in a person could be more a circadian problem, more a poor sleep problem, or more a poor wake problem. And I'm very excited about that. I'm just starting this project.
What does you talk about sleep debt? Can you talk about that a bit more? Because I think for our audience that have like sleep trackers, we have these, even I have one, which is very alarming to me when I wake up. And it says I've got a 36% sleep deficit or something like that. Can you explain sleep deficit a little bit more?
Yeah, so when the way the body works is very remarkable. So when we sleep, there's some kind of restorative process in the brain and the body that happens, so that in the morning you feel good, you have had a restoration of something. And then if you don't sleep 1 night, 2 nights, 3 nights, 4 nights in a row, you will become more and more tired. And in fact, people become completely crazy if they don't sleep several nights in a row. I mean, they become aggressive, it's just impossible. They would fall asleep anywhere. So there is a very, very strong drive that measures how much sleep you need. And if you don't have it, you get sleep deprived. And that's what we call the sleep debt. But that's not the only thing that explains why you're tired. Because otherwise, you would get more and more tired as the day progressed, because you would wake up, you would be rested. And as the day progressed, you would be more and more tired because you would have been awake for longer and longer period of time. And it's not what we observe. We're awake all day long. And the reason is in the morning, indeed, we're rested because we had just slept. So we feel good. But then in the afternoon, we have the circadian clock that raise alertness and raise our body temperature and makes us more awake. So in the morning, you're awake because you just rested, you just had sleep, you have zero sleep debt. And in the afternoon, you're awake because you have a sleep debt, but something compensates for it, which is a circadian clock. And then you fall asleep. And during that first period of sleep, you catch up on your sleep debt. So you have a lot of what we call slow wave sleep. And then after 2 or 3 hours, your sleep debt is better, and then your body temperature drops, and that's a circadian clock that make you sleep longer, even so you have already been resting, and you don't have a sleep debt anymore. So the second part of the night, we sleep more because our circadian clock tells us to sleep extra, and we have mostly REM sleep. And that really explains the fact that in normal people, often people are awake during the morning, and then often in the midday, they're a little tired because they have been awake for 5 or 6 hours, but the wake promotion of the circadian clock has not yet appeared, and there is a little bit of a window where you can take a nap. And the same way at night, very often you fall asleep, and then first you sleep very well because you catch up on your sleep debt, and sometimes you wake up in the middle of the night for a little bit of time because you're already rested from your sleep debt, but then your circadian clock has not kicked in to reduce further your body temperature and have this kind of second sleep. So you see the circadian clock and the sleep debt really work together to make you awake all day and to make you awake all day and asleep all night. And with people with hypersomnia, it's very complicated. Sometimes they are much more tired in the morning, so there could be circadian issues. Sometimes they have a problem in the afternoon. Sometimes they have a problem all day and all night. It's a very diverse phenotype, and we really don't know if it's a sleep debt problem or a circadian problem.
Well, that's really challenging. So with people with idiopathic hypersomnia, when they need to nap and they have excessive daytime sleeping, we know that their naps are essential and also extended and also really, really difficult to come out of. But that's not what you're talking about in terms of like a normal pattern. So just to go back to the normal pattern, and this wasn't actually one of my questions, but now you mention it. I think there's like some debate about, we have this mindset currently where we should all get 6 to 8 hours sleep and like a block of sleep at night, normal people without a sleep disorder. And yet there's an ancient model that says, and I kind of fall into this, so I'm really intrigued, Like I sleep for like a few hours and I'm awake for 3 hours at night, and then I get a second win, and then I go back to sleep in that second, because I have a sleep app and I want to talk to you about those. But that second sleep is really deep and restorative. What are your views on like the public perception of we should all get 8 hours healthy sleep a night? And actually, is that true?
So I think like the idea of being awake and taking a nap and being awake and then sleeping and being a little bit awake and sleeping is not an abnormal pattern. I mean, that's okay. I mean, actually most animals, like monkeys, for example, they do that. They always have a nap during the day and they're always a little bit awake in the middle of the night. So I think humans can have that kind of variation. But trying to sleep for 3 hours, be awake, sleep, be awake every 3 hours, that doesn't make any sense. Just having a nap in the middle of the day and a little period of time where you're awake in the middle of the night, that can be physiological. But like some people have said, we can live on a very fast cycle, like 3 hours sleeping, 3 hours awake, 1 hour sleeping, 3 hours. That is completely crazy. Because if you do that during the evening, for example, it's almost impossible to sleep because of the circadian drive for alertness. Okay. But I want to come back to something you said, which is correct, that I didn't really address in my model of both, the sleep debt and the circadian clock. It's also what you call sleep inertia. We know that when you wake up from sleep, you have a certain glue, probably it takes a while for your brain to switch states completely. And that's another phenomenon, in addition to the sleep debt and to the circadian clocks, that's not very well understood. And definitely some people with idiopathic hypersomnia, of course, many experience this sleep inertia, where they feel that they have a lot of trouble waking up. And sometimes they never feel that they wake up. There is another thing that I feel strongly. So that's one of the agendas that I'm doing in idiopathic hypersomnia, and I'm very excited about it. Is trying to find blood biomarker that will help to differentiate subtype of idiopathic hypersomnia. Those due to circadian clock abnormalities, those due to abnormal sleep debt, those due to abnormal wake, maybe even sleep inertia, etc. But another aspect that I feel is very important is to better study idiopathic hypersomnia. So right now, all the work is around the MSLT, which, as you know, is a test that we use to diagnose idiopathic hypersomnia and narcolepsy. In fact, it's a test that was designed for narcolepsy. And for idiopathic hypersomnia, it just doesn't bring that much information, to be honest. And it's very artificial, because we ask people to try to fall asleep. But also some of the problem with hypersomnia is not trying to fall asleep, is sometimes to stay awake, which is a little bit different.
Yeah, totally. And
what we really need to do is to change this evaluation of idiopathic hypersomnia from the MSLT, this very artificial method, to a method where we just record how sleep and wake is during a normal life. What I think is the idea that everyone believes should be done for this field, actually even for narcolepsy, will be to just have a device that people can wear like a halter, for 2 days, and then we will actually see how people sleep, how they are awake. Do they have microsleep? Do they nap? Or are they in a brain fog, not falling asleep, but having an abnormal EEG? We just don't know anything about that. And I think we have to really understand better the different states of wakefulness.
So now I was going to ask you about because I think there's some development in the home MLST test, correct? And you've been like at the forefront of that. Can you say more about that? Because I think that would change the sleep lab experience for patients. It's just phenomenal, because it's always been fairly traumatic doing sleep studies overnight.
No, absolutely. And not only it's traumatic, but it's expensive. And even worse, it's probably most of the cases useless. But
and it's invasive.
Sorry to say that. Useless, I would say, is already a pretty strong statement. Because there is not a lot of correspondence between the experience of patients with idiopathic hypersomnia and the results of the test. And so as a consequence, I think, and even the response to treatment.
Okay.
So it's a real problem. We are stuck by history, Often things have been done 50 years ago or sometime 100 years ago, and we're just stuck with the same old model. And unfortunately, medicine, like many other fields, is very sticky. It takes a lot of work to change something because people have the habit where you have to, demonstrate that it's better, and it just takes forever. That's actually one thing that, as a researcher, I don't like very much.
I can see that.
To be honest, I think we could do much better, much faster, but there's so many regulations and so many, like the insurance and so many parties involved that changing something is very, very complicated. But there's absolutely no doubt that for the evolution of hypersomnia or sleep disorders in general, we need to study people in their environment. We need to figure out when they fall asleep, if they have problem with cognition during the daytime, if they sleep well at night, how deep it is. And we need to do that in their home, not in a lab. I'm not saying that the lab is completely useless. In some instances, you can still see if you have sleep apnea, you can still see what kind of sleep apnea. You can also do some very complex, more complex physiological recording in complex sleep problems. There's always something more complex than sleep apnea. But for idiopathic hypersomnia, I think we will get enough by just measuring, sleep in a natural environment. So the problem here is a lot of people want to measure it with actigraphy,
Yes.
which is like the watches and, everything that you have, the Fitbit and all this, they are actigraphy. And actigraphy is okay, but it has one major problem if you think about it. If you don't move and you're awake, it tells you you're asleep.
It tells you you're asleep.
That seems like...
I know. I threw my Fitbit out for that. I was like, that's rubbish. I know I've been awake. I was just lying still. So
Exactly.
Hated it.
That's a big problem. And that's why I'm one of the few that believes that you really need more than that. And that you really need at least to have EEGs, recordings. But, it's amazing now there's this electronic that you can print and just stick on your forehead, and there are electrodes and they can measure things. And so I think very soon we'll be able to stick something on our face, and then it will, with a very small batteries that won't be, too much of an impediment to sleeping, and then it will go directly to your cell phone or to somewhere that then will be sent and automatically scored using machine learning. And this is the way to go.
Yeah, it's such a significant development. So soon, you said soon. What does that mean for patients?
Yeah, soon. So, of course, what really annoys me is this is doable now.
Yes,
it's not.
I know.
Like,
you've been working on it for several years, right?
But it won't be. It is feasible now, but it won't be operational in a clinic before. If you're lucky, 5 years. Unfortunately.
But you said it will go to patients' homes, though, not in a clinic. You mean the information will go to a clinic? Okay.
Yes, I think the information will be sent through the internet, and probably some of the artificial intelligence will also be used to automatically score it. But I think there is also a very important research need to try to look also at how the brain waves of people when they are awake look like. Because it seems to me like people with idiopathic hypersomnia are very often awake, but in some kind of fog. It's not just being asleep. It's not only that they sleep, they also have cognitive problems. And I think it would be very important to try to distinguish different cognitive states. We all know that sometimes, I don't have idiopathic hypersomnia, but there are times I'm concentrated, there are times I'm dreamy, there are times I'm kind of, relaxing, and there's a lot of of reason to believe that your brain states are very different in these different conditions. And if we could actually distinguish these substates of wakefulness, even in normal people, I think we may start to understand better, what is wrong with idiopathic hypersomnia.
So we know that people with IH have these really difficult times waking up and they need extended naps during the day, which is a distinction between potentially IH and NT2. So I have two questions. One of them is, can you just elaborate potentially on that distinction between idiopathic hypersomnia and NT2?
Okay.
Narcolepsy type 2.
I know,
I'm sorry. No, I think it's an important question for now, and I'm not expecting like a definitive answer, but it's certainly, it's very current.
Answer.
Okay. Of course you do. All right.
Unfortunately, I have a definitive answer, but I'm not necessarily sure that people will like it. I think everyone now agrees that the way IH and NT2 are separated doesn't mean anything. It's based on having SORM on an MSLT. And there is no correspondence between having SORM on an MSLT and having the symptoms of IH or restorative naps or non-restorative naps. Absolutely no correspondence whatsoever. So I think we are creating a disservice by separating NT2 and IH.
Okay.
See, people suffer as much. It's not like,
totally.
And I think, and actually the treatment is often the same. So what I look much more in IH and narcolepsy type 2 is not that much if people have been in REM sleep or not, but much more how fast they did fall asleep, because that indicates whether they are sleepy or maybe it's more associated with cognitive issues. I'm not saying that I don't disregard completely the SORM, because REM sleep is also very regulated by the circadian clock. So probably the people who have SORM during the day probably have more abnormality of the circadian clock. But I don't think there is a fundamental distinction between IH and narcolepsy type 2 in most cases. And indeed, there are some people, even with IH, that have somewhat restorative naps. And there are some people with IH who, in the classic picture, they are tired all the time. And they have trouble waking up. So the classic clinical picture of IH doesn't fit with the result of the MSLT. So I think we should, almost give up the MSLT for diagnosing IH and narcolepsy type 2. The problem with that is, of course, we need some objective tests, because otherwise people can just say that they're tired and they really have nothing wrong, And it's really important because we are prescribing very strong drugs. And so that's why I think we need to move away from this idea of measuring the MSLT, but rather like measuring sleep and wake during the normal environment, and see if these people have a lot of naps and how their EEG, their brain waves are when they are awake, when they have difficulty waking up. And I'm sure we can find some very objective finding in IH that then also can be targeted by drugs. Because the other advantage of measuring at home is we can give drugs and we can see what's happening. And then we can actually fix the problems that these people have in their home.
So just back up a minute. Talk about SORM.
Oh, yes. Sorry. A SORM is during the MSLT. So this MSLT is a test we classically use to diagnose narcolepsy and IH. And we ask people to take these little naps. And then we look, and to stay awake between the naps. And then we look how fast they fall asleep, which is a sign of being sleepy. And also if they go into REM sleep in these short naps in less than 15 minutes. And this is called a sleep onset REM period, SORM. And that's supposed to distinguish narcolepsy type 2 and narcolepsy type 1 and idiopathic hypersomnia. When they don't have SORM, they're idiopathic hypersomnia, and when they have SORM, they're narcolepsy type 1 and type 2. But for all intents and purposes, now people have shown that this SORM, unless you have cataplexy, which is this narcolepsy type 1, which is a relatively rare form of hypersomnia. If you have narcolepsy type 2, idiopathic hypersomnia, with or without SORM, it may change depending on the day, the moon, very often. So it's not really a specific finding.
It's difficult.
Yes.
Do you see a lot of patients with IH in your clinic?
Yeah, but I would say about 50%.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah, about 50%. I don't really, 50% with NT2 or IH, because for me, I don't really distinguish narcolepsy type 2 or IH. Again, I don't really distinguish people. I have some patients sometimes, they have the exact clinical picture of IH. They sleep a lot. They have trouble waking up. They have to use 5 alarm clocks. When they fall asleep during the day, which they do, they just sleep for a long period of time. They are so tired, they can't wake up. And the classic IH, and we done MSLT, and they had 5 SORM, So do you call them narcolepsy type 2 or IH? For me, they are much more like the clinical picture of IH, and the test doesn't really mean anything.
But it is relevant for the patient, though, isn't it? Because of FDA-approved medication. How would you?
That's a problem.
Yeah,
exactly.
Okay.
You're right.
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about what's approved for patients with IH.
Yeah, and you're right. That's a big problem we have, is that IH has this term idiopathic into it.
I know. I wanted to talk to you about that, because we have people come to us as the Hypersomnia Foundation with, they're sleepy, and they've taken forever to find us, because no one's going to, even if they identify the fact that they are excessively sleeping, or what we call, EDS, excessive daytime sleepiness, they're not going to type in idiopathic hypersomnia. They're never going to do it. So yeah, how do we address that? Because the word is so. What is the history of the words, of the name idiopathic hypersomnia? I mean, you're very much a historian as well as a sleep specialist, right?
Considering my age, unfortunately.
No,
yes.
I didn't mean that. I did not mean that.
No, but you're right.
I know that you've done a lot of you've done a lot of work on the history of sleep. Yeah, you have.
Yeah. No, I like old books, and I have like the first description of these disorders.
What is the origin of the word idiopathic hypersomnia?
Long story.
Because I type it out like 100 times a day, and I'm still like idiopathic hypersomnia.
I know. Some people it used to be called essential hypersomnia. Okay. So I think it'd be a long discussion, because in Japan, they had a different opinion of what should be hypersomnia than the Americans and the Europeans. They all had their schools of thoughts, which started in small medical school, and they tried to call it different ways. And as typical in these cases, the United States won, and then this term idiopathic hypersomnia kind of became the majority, but actually it changed its meaning. Initially, it was described by Bedřich Ross in the Czech Republic as people who would always need to sleep a lot and would never be rested. And then they will fall asleep in this MSRT, these naps in non-REM sleep. So the idea was it was called non-REM sleep hypersomnia, to distinguish it from narcolepsy, where they go into REM sleep, REM hypersomnia. And Bedřich Ross is really at the origin of this term. And idiopathic means without a known cause.
Unknown cause. Yeah. It's kind of like,
and that's
I know, it feels a bit flaky. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, for insurance company, it looks like, it doesn't look like they know what they're talking about. And that's why it has been a bit hard.
Yeah, that doesn't serve the patient at all, does it?
No.
The word idiopathic is like...
So now I think every clinician agrees that idiopathic hypersomnia and narcolepsy type 2 should probably be merged.
Okay.
So question is, how are we going to call it?
I don't know.
If you call it idiopathic hypersomnia, which I personally don't care, and reserve narcolepsy type 1 only for the narcolepsy with low orexin, which is, then the people with narcolepsy type 2, some of them could lose some medications that have been approved under different diagnoses. And then so it's very complicated. I don't have an opinion, but most likely, I think the best for the patient would be if patients with idiopathic hypersomnia and narcolepsy type 2 were called narcolepsy type 2, because at least it's more recognized, and people will probably pay the the medication better. But I don't know.
Yeah. Would that give patients with IH better access to treatment then? Because NT2 is already
Probably a
much
little
more...
bit better, because NT2 is more recognized,
Yeah.
It's kind of an upgrade. But
It's a big identity shift, though.
I know.
It would be quite challenging.
To be honest, thankfully, I'm never going to be the one deciding this.
Don't. Why?
I can tell you.
Because you're not...
Yes.
Wait, what?
Because these things become very quickly political rather than scientific.
And they take decades as well, don't they?
And yeah, I mean, I think Europe will probably take a decision before the US. Yeah. It will be interesting.
So what was the European language around idiopathic hypersomnia then? You told us the American. I mean, let's put a stake in the ground for being European right now.
The European, I think, are leaning toward calling this other condition, narcolepsy without cataplexy, and idiopathic hypersomnia as disorders of hypersomnolence.
Yeah.
A slightly different term, and then maybe merging both. But I don't know, to be honest, where it's going to play out.
Yeah.
It's very complicated.
Yeah, it is.
What is sure is that we need at least idiopathic hypersomnia to be as recognized as narcolepsy type 2 and treated as aggressively, because they react the same way to the same medication. I have patients with idiopathic hypersomnia that have been completely transformed by Xyrem, for example. There's absolutely no doubt about this. And, and some others with a low dose of modafinil. And we just don't have any idea why some people react better to some medication and others to other type of medication. And that's why I think we have to just forget about the old definition and start to fresh to understand maybe why people are tired during the day. Is it circadian? Is it a problem of sleep inertia? Is it a problem of sleep debt? Is it a wake problem? And then we can, I think we'll be able to treat the patients much better.
So as things stand, what medications are available for patients with a traditional diagnosis of IH?
So right now, of course, you can use stimulants, the classic stimulants, which work on a chemical called dopamine or maybe norepinephrine, and they can be either milder, like modafinil, or some rianfetol, or they can be a bit stronger, like methylphenidates or amphetamine. In general, I think you have to try to use a long-acting medication because otherwise there is more risk of addiction. Then there is this particular drug called Wakix, which is antihistamine promoting, which I think can really help. And we can sometimes use it in addition to some of the classic stimulants. And then finally, Xyrem, which helps to sleep at night and make sleep more dense and sometimes more restorative, can really also work very well because the people wake up in the morning and they seem to have slept. So that would suggest that at least some patients with idiopathic hypersomnia, their problem is their sleep is not dense enough.
Right.
Because medication can really help some patients.
Yeah. To what extent then?
The problem is we never know which patient is going to benefit from which medication. That's a little bit of a problem. And of course, this medication have side effects.
Yeah.
So you have to use them very carefully.
All right. Before we jump into side effects, so as a clinician, as a doctor, and you're thinking about what you prescribe your patients, to what extent do you agree with the statement that idiopathic hypersomnia or NT2 is somewhat of a spectrum disorder?
Yeah, it's a spectrum disorder, yes, but Yes, so I agree with the statement, but I see it more clinical than based on the MSLT. So I think, some patients with narcolepsy type 2 and idiopathic hypersomnia have a little bit more restorative naps, for example. Others have much more like prolonged naps and difficulty waking up and more sleep. And there is a gradient between some that are actually more manifesting as kind of being sleepy in terms of falling asleep but feeling better after, and others that feel like sleep is never enough,
Yeah.
And there is like a gradient between these two manifestations. Is that right? Some that may be more cognitive and others that are maybe more like sleep attacks. So in that context, I agree with that there is a gradient. And then, of course, there is also sleep paralysis and hypnagogic hallucinations that's experienced by some patients with narcolepsy type 2 and idiopathic hypersomnia as well. There is also a gradient there. Maybe people who have more restorative sleep, naps, have the tendency to have a little bit more of the idiopathic hypersomnia, of the sleep paralysis, for example, and vivid dreaming. But there too, there's enormous variation. So I really think we need to, again, we really need to start fresh. We need to forget about the MSLT and start to recluster these problems and see which one react better to which medication and study them in a different way. And I propose to study them at home with home sleep recording and wake recordings.
Yeah, I think that would be very warmly welcomed by people with, seeking some greater understanding to their condition. So you talked about side effects of medication. What do you see as being like really significant side effects that would cause you as a clinician to like rethink traditional kind of prescriptive protocols?
So I think the main side effects are, I would say, psychiatric. So sometimes this medication make people feel more anxious, and that can be the case with stimulants, or it can be the case with Xyrem. Sometimes there is a risk of addiction with short-acting stimulants, that the drugs seem to work, but you always need more tolerance, actually, higher and higher dose. And for that, I think you really have to avoid the short-acting medications because those are the most prone to producing this problem. I think those are the main thing to look at after, I would say.
So with people with IH, what's in the sort of pipeline that you're sort of excited about in terms of treatment options for them in the next 2 to 6 years or so?
One question that is still not answered is how orexin agonists, which are now being developed for narcolepsy, with cataplexy, narcolepsy type 1, where they lack the orexin, we know that it's effective on sleepiness. I mean, even normal people feel much more awake. But we never have tried really in these patients with idiopathic hypersomnia. So we can't really tell if it's going to be a good drug or not. But I'm quite excited because that would be one more completely different ways that you can put the brain awake. And I mean, I'm pretty sure that it will help some patients with idiopathic hypersomnia.
Can you say a bit more about how that would work because it's such a novel and new approach to treatment, right? It's going to be hopefully a game changer for people with, NT1, NT2, IH. Can you say a little bit more about how the mechanism of the drug when it hopefully comes to market?
So I think where it helps the most is people who will have a defect in wakefulness, Again, remember I had this ideas that there are people who are tired because their sleep is not dense enough.
Right.
And then there are some people who are tired because they're not awake enough. And then there are people who have problems because their circadian clock is not good enough. I think this should be more helpful for people who have a problem with their wake, because it's really what this compound really does, is it really keeps you awake very, very strongly. It's very dramatic. Even in comparison to amphetamines and very strong dopaminergic stimulants, when you do a test where you ask people to try to stay awake, with this medication, people stay awake the whole time. I mean, they really are not sleepy at all. So I'm sure it will have some very positive application. But I'm sure it's not going to work in everyone.
Right.
That's why we need to understand better these
careful.
subtypes. Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. We just,
that makes sense. I don't know. I just think people would want to, ask you like, what is the timeline for that people can expect to have, access
Probably.
to this new medication?
probably.
I know, it's a hard question.
No, I think 3 to 5 years for sure.
In the US.
I mean, there have been already one drug that went through clinical trial, but it failed because of a liver side effect, which was very unlucky. But there are new drugs coming, and I know at least of 5 different companies who are developing these drugs. So I'm pretty certain that they will. Yeah. And right now they seem to be quite safe. There's not a lot of side effects. Of course, we don't know. There could be a risk of misuse, but they don't look like they are the type of drug to be abused.
Right.
So it's a rather positive landscape for the future.
Yeah, and that's not a new kind of concept either, is it? With Xywav, or what sort of branded previously as GHB, is like the potential for misuse, and that's really not been an issue particularly.
Exactly. I mean, I think if it's well controlled anyway, Of course, the problem is the misuse more than abuse, like if you have a drug that allows you to stay awake all the time, I mean, maybe you don't want to sleep. You just want to work more. And that's becomes where the problem is. It becomes a convenience drug. And in these cases, you probably have health problem, because if you don't respect normal body physiology, you always get in trouble.
Right. And you'll find any way to do that, right?
Yes,
not just that particular abuse. Yeah, that's a different thing.
Even people do that without using drugs. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, what's next for you on the research agenda, Emmanuel? What are you excited about?
Oh, I have 2 main topics. One of them is definitely this general topic, like trying to understand more better. I mean, idiopathic hypersomnia is almost part of a bigger agenda of trying to understand why people are awake and sleeping in terms of physiological mechanism and molecules and genes that makes people awake, sleep more deeply, feel all these different states of mind, and trying to find a much bigger maybe palette of different drugs that could really treat different subtypes of this problem. That's one thing. The second is I'm very interested in how the immune system affects the brain, but that's not related to idiopathic hypersomnia. Even so, we may discover some things. We are discovering now that the immune system is really important also for the brain. And, narcolepsy type 1 is an autoimmune disease where there's an immune attack of some parts of the brain. And it's very likely that a lot of other brain problems result from this kind of autoimmune attack, and more and more are being discovered. Some of them manifest as seizures or neurodegeneration or other things of that nature, and I'm working on them. But I wouldn't be surprised if some of the idiopathic hypersomnia even, or depression, could not be due sometime to this kind of mechanism. I mean, we know, for example, after COVID, a lot of people have experienced these very long-term symptoms. They are probably the result of the immune activation, and then some things that start to cross-react with the brain in ways that we don't understand. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of even idiopathic hypersomnia, depression, or psychiatric disorders are related to this kind of mechanism. So I'm very interested in trying to understand how the immune system, in reacting to infection, can sometimes produce brain disorders.
Have you seen a rise in sleep disorder, like diagnosis post-COVID then?
I don't think I've seen much yet. Certainly not narcolepsy type 1. In fact, if anything, narcolepsy type 1 has decreased because we think it's triggered by the flu. And during the pandemic, people were very careful, so they didn't get the flu. But
Right.
with coronavirus, definitely there is some post cognitive problems and so forth. But I don't think they have yet come
Yeah,
to
it's
our
too
sleep
early.
clinic.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
probably too early. There's so much to think about. Thank you. I'm sure it's
Yeah.
very
No,
helpful
there's a lot
for
to
our
discover,
community. I
for
know,
sure.
I know. I could talk to you for absolutely hours. Thank you on lots of
Yeah.
levels for what you do in the lab, for all the
I enjoy
tedious
it. So
administration that you don't enjoy. I know that you don't. But thanks for doing that, and also for being so willing to interact with our community and prioritizing that, actually. And I know that you're also an awesome doctor. And that's a rare and winning combination, Emmanuel, to have that
Thank you.
brilliance and also the bedside manner that I saw probably about 13 years ago. So thank you very much on behalf of the Hypersomnia Foundation and all patients affected by sleep, and even us sleepy parents. Thank you very much. Be deep.
that is true. We should not forget the sleepy parents, because we see a lot of kids as well. And it's really hard when you have a kid with a sleep disorder. But anyway, no, I enjoy what I'm doing. I think we make a big difference. And I think the field of sleep in general is very exciting, because
Yeah, I
it's
do
at the
too.
confluence of the improvement in technology, in computer science, in biology. It's a perfect area to continue to make progress to help people.
Yeah, it seems really fast paced, even in the last like 2 or 3 years in terms of research and drug development. Of course, much of that is down to you. So thank you, and all your many brilliant colleagues as well, globally speaking. So it's a really exciting time, I think, within industry, but actually, of course, for patients and for caregivers. That, yeah, you're quite right. We're all in it together. So thank you so much for all of those pieces.
Thank you for doing the work you are doing for the Hypersomnia Foundation.
Yeah,
I know
love
that I have heard a lot of good things about how you educate patients and providers. So